Oh shoot, I just revealed the end of the stream. Ignore that. Welcome to the Gravity Max live stream. Today is Sunday, August 15th, I believe. 16th? I do not know. It doesn't really matter. This is episode 6 of season 4. What do you think about that? We're about halfway through.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, so time's flying, I would say. And we've got a fun episode today. It is about that dude with the apple. I don't know if you know his name. It's like the guy where the apple fell on his head. I just can't think of his name. So that's who we're talking about today. And let's just get started.
Let's do it.
Alright, so this video is not intended for children under 13 years old. If you are under 13 years old, please do not watch this video, as the topics we discuss are meant for those with at least a high school level of education. If you are not 13, you will not understand the scientific topics discussed in this video. So that's just a disclaimer. Alright. So also visit the Gravity Max website at gravitymaxmedia.com. Follow Gravity Max on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Links in the description. Also follow Sebastian on social media. You had a pretty fun live stream yesterday yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, I was redesigning some of my old thumbnails because they sucked in the past. So I wanted to redo them, share my graphic design knowledge with y'all. You know how it is.
Yeah.
It was fun. It's like an hour, 40 minutes.
Yeah. If you want, and you picked some pretty good background music, I would say. So if you guys want a nice, relaxing, and of course you have your radio-worthy voice. So if you want to watch that while you're doing some work or something.
I did an entire stream without any drink of water or anything, so near the end, you can hear, like, my throat dying on me. I'm, like, swallowing more. It's because I just did not bring any water for that stream. And it was hot as hell in my room. It was terrible.
That sucks. Yeah. Well, anyway. Also follow Sebastian on Instagram and Twitter. But, yeah, mainly check out the YouTube channel. He's above 128 subscribers, so.
Yeah, we're at 138 now.
Nice. Quickly growing. Like, you're going really fast, I would say.
Thank you.
Maybe it's not really... maybe, like, my perspective is just so slow, and that's, like, the normal pace.
Yeah.
But...
I'll pop the analytics.
Yeah, the analytics. But you started your channel, like, just a little while ago, like a few
6 months ago.
6 months, yeah. Wow.
Yeah,
so, yeah. But anyway, links to everything in the description, including Jacob's channel as well, Daikaiju Productions. You make a lot of really cool stop-motion films, and then sometimes I see a comedy skit on there, like live-action comedy skit, so you've got a variety of things. So check it out, it's pretty cool. Oh yes, and then A Bottled Up Flame coming to Amazon November 1st. It is the sequel to A Truly Dead Rock. It is the second book I have written. And you should buy it. I have a link in the description to purchase A Truly Dead Rock if you have not yet, because this book will be coming out November 1st, and if you haven't read the first book yet, then you should read it, because, you know, this is a sequel, and that's sort of how things work. It does work as a standalone book, but there are a lot of references to the first one, and I really think that if you would enjoy this book, you would enjoy it more having read the first one. And yeah, if you want to read some sci-fi, got 2 sci-fi books for you. So make sure to check that out. And with that dude with the apple.
He's a smart guy.
Yep.
He was also other things, other than just being a smart guy. What did he do? Let's find out.
Yeah. So, Isaac Newton, this is the guy that we were talking about. Everyone knows his name, obviously. I would say Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein are the 2 most prolific scientists when it comes to, like, household names. there is nobody else. Like, it's very close between the two of them, but there's nobody else. Like, we're going to talk about other people in here, but like, Robert Boyle, that is not a household name. Not even Edmund Halley, but I would say he gets closer, but he does not reach that level, even though he has a comet named after him. Newton and Einstein, they are the two most famous ones. So I guess if we were to do another biography episode, it would probably be on Einstein.
Yeah. I never thought of Isaac Newton as a British guy. I always thought he was like from Philly or something. It never really registered in my head that he was from England. I always thought he was like a lad, just from the colonies.
Yeah, so he was born in 1643. So
yeah, okay.
No. I'm just saying, because you don't really know exactly. I didn't know he was born in specifically 1643. So yeah, the colonies weren't like super developed at that point, and he died before the American Revolution, 49 years before the American Revolution. So he's a bit earlier, but definitely. But he actually, he's pretty much like one degree of separation away, because he knew kind of these Enlightenment thinkers. He would talk to them, because there was a lot of there was a lot of intermingling, which is really interesting, because there are some people in here that you might be surprised to see, some historical figures. But there was a lot in sort of the intellectual circles. There would scientists would also be theologians, so theology people would talk with scientists. There was actually a theological requirement as part of what Newton had to do. We'll talk about that later. But there are a lot of connections. Then, scientists, people in theology, they would talk to writers and, then politicians, because Isaac Newton eventually got into British Parliament. So there's a lot of intermingling, whereas today I would say the sciences and just academia is a lot more divided, don't you think?
Yeah.
There's a lot more specialization too, I would say, because everything that Newton did, work on gravity, calculus, like the study of light, no scientist today could work on all three of those things in more than like a trivial level. They couldn't create breakthroughs in all three of those things. Like, they need to hyper specialize. Even within a field, say calculus. Calculus is even too broad for someone to make new discoveries. They have to be imaginary complex number, blah 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 calculus. Science has gotten super specific, which is really interesting. It's just because we know so much now. Like, the tree of knowledge has branched out. So, with that being said, let's get right into it. We're going to go over this man's life. So it starts with his childhood, from 1643 to 1661. So, this is just until he turns 18. Childhood. Newton grew up in England. He was an Englishman. He grew up, I believe it was Grantham, near Cambridge, which is where he would eventually go to college. I think for most of our viewers, England is kind of specific enough. I don't think people really care that much, other than British people. Only British
locations.
Yeah, only British people care about places in Britain. But if someone said, Sebastian, if in an alternate universe, a British version of our live stream, if they were to say, "Oh, this guy was born in America," and we were watching it, we'd be like, "Where?"
Yeah, well, that's because America isn't the size of how big is it? It's not even the size of Texas. Not even the size of
England is the size of a medium state.
Exactly, it's a medium state, bro.
All right, I'll give you that concession. Anyway, let's just get right into it. So we start with a special birthday. So this is just some interesting factoids. So Isaac Newton, according to the Julian calendar, which was in place at the time of his birth, it was, I'll explain that in a second, but he was born on December 25th, 1642, which is Christmas. And, theoretically, the birthday of Jesus Christ. So that's just an interesting fact about Newton, that he was also born on Christmas. And he was also born the same year in the Julian calendar that Galileo died in Italy, because, Galileo was Italian. So it's just sort of an interesting, reference frame, because, Galileo had been the champion of heliocentrism. There had also been Copernicus, but he published everything posthumously, so he had already died, because he knew the kind of backlash he would face. But something interesting is that Galileo in Italy was in a Catholic area. So the Protestant Reformation had occurred a little over a century previous, I would say a century and a half, with Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, but Martin Luther, who, the namesake. So England had split off from the Catholic Church because of, King Henry VIII starting the Anglican Church. So they weren't Protestant, they were Anglican, but they were sort of part of the Reformation in that they left Catholicism. So whereas the Catholic Church was, more geocentric, the Anglican Church was a bit more open, which is interesting. So in England, heliocentrism, by the time that Newton was going to college, was accepted. The view of the solar system. And if you think about it today, heliocentrism isn't even accepted anymore, because the sun isn't the center of the universe. There is no center of the universe. We are acentric, I guess. There is acentrism in the universe, in the model of the universe. But it's pretty close to the modern model. With heliocentrism, it was that the sun is the center of the universe, not just the solar system. They didn't really think that there were other solar systems out there. But all this is to say that these are the foundations that Newton was working with. Johannes Kepler, he died 20 years before Newton was born, and Kepler had laid down the laws of planetary motion, the 3 laws about elliptical orbits. But yeah, so it's just sort of interesting, these sort of just coincidences, and it's a good framing device, I would say. But one last thing of note is that Newton was really born on January 4th, 1643, if you were to count back the days. But the thing is, the Julian and the Gregorian calendars were both in use during this time period. It was a transitional period. The Julian calendar was in use previously, but then people started to realize, hey, wait a minute, it's spring, but, it's freezing outside. It's April, but it's freezing outside because the calendar was drifting. So there was the new system and the old system. And in the old system, he was born on Christmas. So let's move on to the next slide. Unless you guys have anything to say.
Calendars. I use them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so do I. So family trouble. Isaac Newton had some family troubles that started even before he was born. His father died a few months before Newton was born, which was, unfortunate for him. And when he was 3 years old, his mother remarried, and he did not like his stepdad. There is a later, text from Newton, a document, from a notebook or something, when he's, 19 years old, where he confesses to, a ton of sins that he has committed. And one of those sins that he self-reported on this little notebook paper to get off his chest was that he had threatened to burn down his family estate with his mother and stepdad inside just because he hated them so much. So he was a bit unhappy sometimes, but there was a bit of conflict. And on the left, that is the Newton family coat of arms, like family crest thing, which I find interesting. Like, I don't know why it's crossbones, but it just is. So then that's a family tree on the right. But let's see what else about Newton. Well, another interesting thing, obviously, I said, estate. Newton's family, like, he wasn't, like, poor in London. His family was, like, upper class already. But, like, they weren't part of the nobility or anything. But, they did well for themselves. They owned a large, like, farm place, and that would eventually come back to sort of haunt him a little bit, but that's for just a bit later. So, is there anything else you guys have to say about this?
He's got daddy issues.
Yeah.
Newton, the greatest, arguably one of the greatest minds that this earth has ever seen, had daddy issues.
Yeah. It's interesting. I did like a sort of deep dive on Monday and Tuesday, but last Monday and Tuesday. So I have got a ton of like facts. I've sort of forgotten some of them because it was over a week ago, but like I feel like, I'm reigniting those pathways by looking at the presentation again. But then we had to delay it for the storm, so here we are. So the English Civil War. The English Civil War was a major event that was occurring all throughout Newton's childhood. So it started in 1644 with basically Parliament and King Charles I did not get along. Of course, there were factions of Parliament that like supported the king, but there were other factions that were against him, and this ignited a civil war. And by 1649, the king had been deposed and beheaded. His son, Charles II, was exiled. So what ended up happening was England became a commonwealth, the Commonwealth of England, I believe. I'm not, like, I know sort of the basic facts. I'm not sure on that name, but it became a commonwealth. And it was led by this guy, I forget his first name. I think it might be Oliver Cromwell, something Cromwell. And he was the Lord Protectorate of the Commonwealth. And when he was done being the Lord Protectorate, he passed the role on to his son. And so you might be asking, what's the difference between just a monarch and a Lord Protectorate? And I don't think there's really that much of a difference. So it's kind of funny because he's basically like, down with monarchy, let's get rid of the king, and then he becomes pretty much the king just by a different name. So Cromwell, he didn't do so great, nor did his son, because eventually Charles II came back 10 years later and brought the army back on his side and led a coup, and he got reinstated, the throne. He took the throne again. So Charles II became the King of England right around the time that Newton was like 18 or 17 or 18, so around there. So that was a pretty important event, and it was sort of the atmosphere around Cambridge. Once he went to Cambridge, everyone was sort of like vibing because they were like, yeah, the king's back, the return of the king. So they were sort of jazzed about that. But yeah, so that's an event. So the King's School
on that college campus, people were like, "Hey, yo, the King's back," and they're like, "Let's toast up, bro."
Yeah, exactly.
There's 1,500 frats. That's gotta be fun.
Yeah, they had a lot of mead, I suppose. Lots of alcohol. Anyway, this is the King's School in Grantham, and it's pretty much where Newton went to high school, but of course this is like Britain, so I guess secondary school.
What do you think like 1600s college pranks were like? Were they just like the olden versions of the ones we have now, or were they like super messed up? Like,
I bet they didn't have college pranks.
Oh, they definitely did. Are you kidding me?
No, I'll get into that. I'll get into that in a second. But yeah. So when this was Newton's not higher, but like before college. So I guess you could say college preparatory education. So he went to this school, the King's School in Grantham, and at first he didn't really care. Sort of like, I've heard, and I'm not sure if this is a myth or like a misrepresentation, but I'm pretty sure it's not entirely true when people say like Albert Einstein dropped out of school at the age of 11, you know, as like reassurance for people that aren't doing so well. But
at least we have Zuckerberg, who dropped out of college.
Yeah.
So they have that.
Yeah.
I heard that Einstein didn't do too well in school, though. Not sure if he actually ended up dropping out.
Yeah, well, I definitely with a lot of these sort of people, sometimes they are like too cool for school. You know, they're too smart, and so the classic education system just doesn't really work because they are just too beyond. I feel like that's sort of Isaac Newton. He was like bored and he didn't really care. But then he got into it just because he was like, oh shoot, I should actually like do the work here and whatever. So his grades quickly increased, and then he had a schoolyard bully. And the way that he like beat him was by getting better grades than him, like by the end of like the whatever. Which is interesting because I don't think that would really work today.
It would not.
It would not get.
That's England.
Yeah, it would not work today. Yeah, maybe that would work still in England today. But yeah, I just find that interesting. Imagine being the guy that bullied Isaac Newton.
There's that thing. One of the actors off of Friends, Matthew Perry, in high school, he bullied Justin Trudeau.
Wow.
I think that's hysterical.
That's pretty funny. That's interesting. Wow, actor and Prime Minister of Canada. Anyway, when Newton was done with school here, his stepdad, who he didn't like, died when Newton was about 18, so he wasn't particularly sad. But his mom was like, oh, you got to come back to the estate. You know, you got to manage the farm, essentially, because it was a big rural estate, and Newton was like, he did not want to be a farmer. So it took a while, but he eventually got the headmaster of the school to convince his mother that he should actually be going to college, he should like pursue higher education, that it would actually be worthwhile so that he shouldn't be a farmer. And so eventually that happened. And he got accepted to Cambridge. So he went to Cambridge. Well, it didn't take him that long to graduate, but once he graduated, he pretty much instantly like became a professor there. So he was at Cambridge for a long time. And so, yeah, I guess you were talking about the college pranks, and so we can revisit that topic. We can come back now. What do you think the 1600 pranks were?
I'm just thinking like 2 a.m. in the morning, the lads just creep over to another frat's dorm, and under the space in the door, they just throw a rat in there, and they're like, now you got the plague, cucker, you know.
Okay.
And then they all
I was kind of thinking that it'd be like a plague prank.
Interesting. Well, there is one thing. Newton didn't have a lot of friends, I would say.
Or think about it. Like, what just came out around that time? Like Shakespeare stuff, and like I don't know when Edgar Allan Poe stuff came out, but maybe they could, instead of like, you know, after you and your friends watch a scary movie, you like sometimes like dress up as the creature from the scary movie to mess with them, to scare them. They would do that. They would like knock on the door and be like, Lenore, to like scare everyone in there. They would be like, oh my god, I just read that. You know, like, I'm waiting for the sequel. That would be hysterical.
Interesting. So Newton, he did not make many friends at college. He did not like that people were too rowdy, essentially. So he didn't like the atmosphere. They were all getting drunk all the time. they were all messing around essentially, and he was like, serious. I'm here on serious business.
This just is Isaac Newton's a beta. He's a beta male.
Okay, anyway, yeah, so Newton he was very focused on his work, not just his schoolwork, but like his own work. So he would just pretty much be working like in his room, in his study all the time with a quill and ink, which just sounds so horrible. Like, I would not be happy with that. It's so much easier to type. And you can store it so much easier. But anyway, let's begin. So Newton went to the Trinity College, which was the Anglican sort of like religious-based thing, but it was also like science and stuff. So science and religion were intertwined for quite a long period of time, like scientists and religious leaders, they sort of worked together for a while. And to become a professor in the Trinity College, which Newton eventually would, you had to become ordained as a priest in the Anglican Church. So you also had to take an oath of chastity, which Newton eventually did, which is why people often say Isaac Newton died a virgin, and that is because of religious purposes. So,
and he's beta male.
Okay, yeah, sure. So at the Trinity College, he studied, but he was doing most of the work on his own. Like, he was doing his own work and just doing schoolwork to pass school, doing schoolwork to get through school. The education system, has always been flawed. So there have always been people that are just doing school because you need to do school when, like, they really don't. But regardless, he stayed at Trinity College at Cambridge for a while, but then they shut down Cambridge and sent everyone home because of the plague that came to London, because London was, and I would argue still is, disgusting.
Yes.
No, I'm just kidding. Generally, cities are disgusting. So I will broaden that statement. Cities tend to be disgusting. So I wasn't targeting London. But
the freaking, what's the river? What's the river that's right? Like the Thames?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like shit river. If you've ever seen it.
That is true.
Literal shit river. It's terrible.
Yeah, so the bubonic plague came to London in 1665, and Cambridge is separate. It's not like on the opposite side of England, for all of you that care, but it's close. It's pretty close to London, I would say. Cambridge is close to London. So eventually, in I forget the year, I think 1667, they had to shut down Cambridge. And so they're like, okay, everyone go home and quarantine. So Newton, to avoid infection, he quarantined at his estate. So we can all kind of relate to that right now, other than the estate part, but we can relate to the quarantine part. So we've all been quarantining. And so I find it pretty interesting. He spent 2 years in quarantine. Hopefully this current situation does not last as long, because we have technology that they did not have in the 1660s.
We have technology.
So yeah. While Newton was in quarantine, though, was when he did a lot of his most revolutionary work, but he wouldn't publish it for many years because he it's interesting. He wasn't studying things for other people's sake. He was studying them because, he wanted to know the fundamental answers to the universe, essentially, just for himself. He didn't care because there are and were a lot of, politics in science, and not national politics, but just politics as in if you disagree with this person, then there's a grudge, and then you have to defend your argument. Newton was not interested in defending his argument and properly debating. He was just he just wanted to figure it out. And once he figured it out and knew it for himself, he's like, there's no point in telling everyone, like it doesn't really matter. So eventually he would publish things though, because people would be like having casual conversation with him, and then he would like say something revolutionary, and then they'd be like, wow, you should probably publish that. And then he's like, okay. So yeah, so these are some of the stuff, this is some of the stuff he did in quarantine. One of 3 was work on light, the study of light, known as optics. So one of the things he did to study how vision works and how light worked was he took like a metal rod called a bodkin, but it's referred to as a needle as well. Sometimes he basically stuck it in the space between his eye and his eyelid. There's a diagram there. So, and then he would push on his eye to like see how it changed his vision, and then he'd be like, interesting. So
okay, yeah, he's no longer. No
wonder this guy doesn't have a Darwin Award. It's like the modern day equivalent of sticking a hand in the microwave. It exploded. Awesome.
Yeah, exactly. Thankfully, I guess, for the entire world, right, he didn't infect himself with something or like rupture his eye. So he did that for a little bit, and then he was like, okay, I need like an easier way to show this, because I'm not sure how many, like I'm not sure sticking a needle in my eye is like the best tactic. I'm not sure how long that'll like work scientifically. So he got a prism, and the phenomenon of white light refracting into a rainbow once passed through a prism, that was known for a while. People would basically, they'd go up to their window. This is how scientists sort of did it, because they didn't have like a laser. They didn't have a light bulb. They didn't have white light to use. All they had for artificial lighting was candles, and that's more on the yellow-orange range. That's like incandescent, if you look at the black-body curve. So they would just use sunlight, and they would basically, put up a large curtain with like a single hole in it, and then that beam of light would go into their prism and refract into the rainbow, and then they would be like, why is this occurring? So the accepted hypothesis, and I believe this was René Descartes, who was also a previous scientist, sort of like he was sort of accepted. He was like a Frenchman. Sort of a lot of his theories were accepted at the time, and I believe one of them, which was the consensus, was that prisms were actually altering the light rather than, like, they were altering. So basically there was something in the prism that turns white light into the spectrum of colors. Whereas as Newton studied it, he was like, no, the prism merely separates white light into the spectrum of colors. So there's nothing fundamental about the prism that is doing it, essentially, is sort of the argument. So the way he figured that out was that he would take a prism, right, and then get the spectrum of light. But then when he would take another prism and, say, put just the red light through the prism, it would stay red. Whereas if there was something about prisms that fundamentally altered light, you would expect that the red would separate into more colors. But it just stayed red. So Newton was like, okay, all these colors are part of white light, and prisms just refract them and separate them. And of course, he wouldn't make that argument to people until a while later. But once he did, he was faced with rebuttal, which is exactly what he was trying to avoid. But yeah, so this is some of his work on optics. So the next slide, he worked on calculus. However, he called it fluxions with an X. That was his...
It's a fire name. It's just a fire name, Like, you can be like, oh, I studied calculus in high school. Or you can be like, hey, yo, I've been researching up my fluxions, Take that.
Yeah, so it's interesting. This is sort of part of a later dispute that Newton would have with the mathematician Wilhelm Gottfried Leibniz. And Leibniz's name for this thing was calculus. So we are using Leibniz's word for it. So in some parts of this debate, Leibniz won, and in other parts, Newton won. Because usually if you ask the average person who invented calculus, the most common response I think you would get, other than I don't know, I think I don't know would probably be the most likely, but then it would be Newton. And then after that, you might get some like, well, it's complicated. It's like Newton and Leibniz. So the like consensus is that Newton and Leibniz independently developed calculus, but Leibniz would eventually accuse Newton of plagiarism. So we'll get to that in a bit. But yeah, basically the reason Newton developed calculus was because of another problem that he was working on, which is the next slide. But this other problem he was working on, he realized essentially that he couldn't solve it with the current mathematics. He was like, I am limited by the technology of my time. There wasn't enough math to figure out this problem. So he's like, I'll just invent new math. And then he did so. So if you know these symbols, if you've taken calculus, dy dx and d squared y dx squared, that's the first and second derivative. And that is actually Leibniz's notation. So that's like how Leibniz showed calculus. But Newton, he just put a little dot above the thing, and then each derivative got another dot. So you would get y with a dot is the first derivative, y with two dots is the second derivative. And yeah, so that's sort of what he did. He worked on calculus. But as I said, as part of the sort of debate and conflict between the two, Leibniz notation is the widely accepted one, and Leibniz's name, calculus, is also the widely accepted one, whereas Newton is more often given credit. So they both kind of split the winnings, I guess you could say, on that one. But yeah, so that's it for this slide. Should I go to the next slide? Do you guys have anything to add?
I've not taken calculus yet, but I'm sure when I do, I will go back in time and beat the living crap out of both Leibniz and Newton, because, you know, it's complicated and they individually developed it. Because I'm sure that would be some difficult, some difficile type stuff. You know,
yeah, I found calculus.
Of course,
all is that Newton, he invented optics and he invented calculus in quarantine. What have you done? Audience, spectator.
Yeah, I know. That's
watching us all.
And especially with the next thing that he figured out. But yeah, it's funny to look at these historical figures and feel like, wow, I am really not accomplished at all.
Yeah.
But anyway, this is the final and arguably most important, I would say, most important discovery was gravity. So Newton, and it is undisputed, he was, you know, the discoverer of gravity. Whereas there was a Leibniz dispute on calculus, he was like, I'm the gravity guy. Except I think actually Robert Hooke eventually would sort of argue about it. So Newton tended to be contested a lot. But, you know, nobody knows Robert Hooke. You probably have not heard that name before, I would guess. Whereas people have heard of
Japan.
Yeah. Yeah, he is. Exactly.
Wait, who did Robert?
I'm sure he's the artist of Japan.
Oh, okay. The pirate? Yeah. Okay.
No, but no, I have heard of him before.
Oh,
I'm going to talk to Robert Hooke.
Yeah. No, he was the guy that found the cell, right? He invented the microscope, and then he was the guy that found what cells actually are. Let me look that up. I think it was him. Here, hold on.
Well, anyway, while you're looking that up, so
yeah, it is. Yeah.
Oh, it is. Okay. Never mind. So Robert,
he invented the microscope, and then he found cells.
Okay. Interesting.
See, I'm an intellectual.
Interesting. Yeah, I was just focusing on Newton for this one. But yeah, so this depicted is the famous, likely apocryphal story of Newton sitting under an apple tree in his orchard in his estate, and, you know, probably like reading a book or something, like, ba-ba-da-ba-da, and then an apple falls on his head. He's like, huh, I guess that means gravity exists. So when you really think about it, right, this is kind of a ridiculous story. And so it kind of makes sense that it was likely fictitious. But it makes sense if you believed that it was true, because Newton himself would tell this story, despite the fact that it was likely fictitious. It was a story that he told later in life. Isaac Newton lived to the age, I don't know, 70, I'm trying to do the math because I know when he was born and when he died, 77. So he was pretty old by the time he died. So when he was older and, you know, like retired, he would be like, did I ever tell you the tale of when I was sitting under an apple tree and I got hit in the head with an apple and that made me discover gravity? So he told that story, but he told it verbally, and then his niece, eventually, who he had lived with later in life, would tell it to Voltaire, who is the Enlightenment author, Voltaire, and Voltaire would write it down in one of his books, and that was the first written, like, evidence of this story, which is really fascinating. That's the origin of the apple story. But apple or not, right? Go ahead.
Yes, you could say the apple knocked some sense into him.
Ah, there you go.
Yeah, so whether or not this apple story is true, I mean, I would say it's likely it didn't actually hit him in the head, but like he was sitting there and like he saw apples fall because he was in an orchard, you know. So regardless, right, Newton figured out gravity. He was like, why does the moon go around the earth around the sun? Why do things fall down? He wanted to figure that all out, and nobody could really figure it out. So he proposed gravity, and again, he was frustrated at first because he didn't have the correct math to pursue this, but then he invented calculus, and so he eventually worked out that gravity was proportional to the mass of the two objects involved and the square, or divided by the square, of the distance of the two objects apart. And so, yeah, it was pretty interesting. And he wouldn't tell anyone for a long time. But something important about his, theories of gravity, which were pretty revolutionary. The first one was that it required action at a distance, because, there isn't like a large rope tying the Earth and the Moon together, there's nothing observable, like, why does this thing fall? Like, what is there connecting it to the Earth? They're not touching. It makes no sense. It was perplexing. But Newton was actually, he dabbled in alchemy, which, is pretty interesting. He really
was the Full Metal Alchemist.
He really got around to just, doing things, yeah. I suppose he was trying to resurrect his father. But, yeah, so he was into alchemy, and because he was into alchemy, it's likely that he was more open to the idea of a force that acts, at a distance, whereas other scientists were not. They would deem that, impossible, supernatural. And another important thing was that he said that the laws that governed the Earth were the same as the laws that governed the heavens, which was something very new at the time. Once he published his works in the Principia, most people sort of thought that they were two separate realms. There was the heavens and the earth, and there were different laws to govern these different areas. The domain of God and the domain of man must have different laws, right?
You're saying that people thought the heavens were quite literally above the law?
Ah, right.
Yes,
there.
You could go with that. But yeah, so they separated things out, and it kind of makes sense because just things in the sky are so far away. And the way that we interact with things in the sky is so different from how we interact with things on the ground. like it's hard to make the connection between the moon going around the Earth and an object falling down. So it was a pretty big leap to make, and pretty cool that he figured that out. But yeah, so that's why it's his universal law of gravitation, because it applies everywhere. So yeah, that's gravity. So after the plague, Cambridge opened back up again. Newton returned to Cambridge, and he became a professor at Cambridge. So he quickly became the Lucasian Professor of Mathematics, which is one of the most prestigious academic roles that a person can have. He was the second Lucasian professor after Isaac Barrow, and other people that have held this position in the past include Stephen Hawking. So, very important role. It's something I really find interesting about England and British history is that it is really so much older than American history, obviously, because, American history, goes back a little bit further than the revolutions. You can go back to the colonies, but there are no, institutions that stretch back as far as some of these British institutions. So the Lucasian professorship was started with Isaac Barrow. Let's see, what year does that say? It says 1663, I guess. But yeah, Isaac Newton got the role in 1669. And yeah, so he lectured at Cambridge. He taught students. Typically, he lectured on optics. And he was supposed to write down all of his lectures and put them in the Cambridge library, but he couldn't waste his time on that, essentially. He was too important for that. So he often neglected his duty. And he was an interesting person, because a lot of these really smart people that become famous in history are kind of annoying to be around if you think about it. If you are someone that has to deal with them, because they do things differently. I mean, necessarily, because to change, how the world runs, to change the dynamic and the paradigm, you kind of have to be off the bell curve. You have to be out of the ordinary. And so they can be frustrating to deal with. So Newton did a lot of things that upset people. One of them was that he was reluctant. He did not want to become ordained as a priest, which was a requirement for Trinity College to be a professor. And people were at first they sort of let it slide. They're okay. But then once he became the Lucasian professor, they're okay, you really got to get ordained as a priest now. And so he eventually appealed to King Charles II to make an exception for him. And when he got the letter, Charles II was oh, why is this a thing in the first place? And he just removed the requirement. So he was oh, this is stupid. Yeah, let's get rid of this. Sure, you don't have to be ordained as a priest. And yeah, but Newton took the oath of chastity, which is interesting, even though he never became a priest. But another thing which was interesting was that Newton sort of got into heretical areas. He did not believe in the Holy Trinity, which, could be a problem at Trinity College. But he kept it to himself. He basically believed that the first commandment, which is thou shalt have no other gods before me, he believed that having the Holy Trinity violated that, because, there are two other people or figures, the Holy Spirit and Jesus, that would not fit the definition of God in his eyes, because they were different. So he viewed the concept of the Trinity as heresy, while obviously the Anglican Church would view his views as heretical. And if this got out, he would have been put in prison, not necessarily executed, but put in prison for heresy. So he kept it to himself. But because of his beliefs, it made him uncomfortable to become a priest. So he did not want to become a priest. So that was why he made the appeal. But yeah, so he was a professor for a while. But then he joined the Royal Society. So the Royal Society, the full name is the Royal Society of London. It was started in like the 1660s, I believe. Yeah, so it was sort of new when Newton was accepted to it, but the Royal Society still exists today. They have many buildings. They have this big building, like library, archive, where they actually have Newton's original draft of the Principia, like handwritten, notes to the editor, like the ready-to-print version, essentially. They actually have the original document there. And they have, of course, the Royal Society. Just like the Lucasian Professorship, it is another sort of British institution, scientific institution that is very prestigious. They admit, I would say, about a dozen scientists every year to the Royal Society. And if you become a member of the Royal Society, you are a certified legend, I would say. Like Stephen Hawking, also Lucasian Professorship, he was also in the Royal Society. A lot of famous scientists, pretty much like all throughout history, like 1600s and afterwards, were all in the Royal Society. Einstein was in the Royal Society, I believe. So it's a real honor to be in the Royal Society. But yeah, it was started, I believe, by Charles II because it's the Royal Society, but it focused on science and things like that. So a ton of scientists were part of this like club. So it was like the elite scientists club. And the way that he got admitted was pretty interesting because he was not the one to make the initiative. He did not want to open himself up for criticism. So he was not the one that tried to get admitted. So this is the story of how that happened. So the previous Lucasian professor, Isaac Barrow, Dr. Isaac Barrow, he was the one that got Newton into the Royal Society. So he and Newton were, friendly. I mean, like, they had to work together in Cambridge because Newton was his successor as the Lucasian professor. So on his desk, essentially, just like in his study, Newton had this little telescope. And Isaac Barrow found it pretty incredible, and he said, "Can I show this to the Royal Society?" And Newton's like, "Okay, fine." And so this is a really interesting telescope. This is the Newtonian telescope, and pretty much all telescopes today, even space telescopes, the James Webb telescope, for instance, Hubble Space Telescope, they all run on the same principle that the original Newtonian telescope did. So Galileo was the first person to invent a telescope, but those were Galilean telescopes. Now, what's the difference? Galilean telescopes used two lenses to magnify light, whereas the Newtonian telescope just used mirrors to magnify light. And so the reason that Newton wanted to make a telescope using mirrors was because of his study his study of optics. So because he realized that prisms refract light, he figured that the lenses of a Galilean telescope do the same. And that's true. Galilean telescopes have a problem called chromatic aberration, where if you look at an object like the moon, you'll get a fuzzy blue border around it. If you try to look at things, it's poor resolution, and it's often chromatic, as the name suggests, because the lens refracts blue light more than red light, and so it all gets a little muddled. But when Galileo invented it, it was obviously extremely powerful because they didn't have any telescope. So this was sort of the first, and only really, this was like the major innovation to the telescope, the Newtonian mirror telescope. So whereas like a Galilean telescope would need to be 6 feet long to get the same resolution as the Newtonian telescope, which was like 6 inches long. So the Newtonian telescope was just incredible for how much it improved on the design. And Newton, after he made it, he actually made it himself. Like, he made the mirrors. He mortar and pestle, polish. He made the alloy and ground it all, polished it. And and he made the mirrors himself for his telescope. And he was just using it, as a telescope, just casually. He just casually say, he would like observe Jupiter and be like, oh, I see the Galilean moons. And so Isaac Barrow was like, this is revolutionary. You got to show it to someone. And so Barrow brought it to the Royal Society. So yeah, that's the first instance where Newton sort of just sat on things until people were like, wow, this is really cool. You should show it to someone. And he was like, oh, okay. But he wouldn't do it himself, which is interesting. But after Barrow brought it to the Royal Society was like, yeah, this is really cool. Can you come and tell us how it works? And Newton is like, sure. And then he like presented it to them. And with that, they admitted him into the Royal Society. So that occurred in 1672. If you guys have anything to chime in, I'm going to go to the next slide.
Go right on ahead.
All right. So Robert Hooke. So yeah, the guy invented the microscope, discovered the cell. Robert Hooke and Newton were fierce rivals they were never on good terms up until Hooke's death. And when Newton became the president of the Royal Society, he failed to preserve the one existing portrait of Robert Hooke, just sort of out of spite, it's assumed. And so this portrait was painted in 2004 because, there was no existing painting. So this is based on descriptions. This is based on written descriptions of Robert Hooke, which is pretty interesting. I never thought about it before, but I imagine there are quite a few historical figures that have been painted just based on written descriptions because they weren't painted while they were alive. Because, portrait making is expensive. You have to hire someone and sit down for 6 hours, and they have to be skilled, and that is how you take a photo, like imagine. Whereas I can just sort of, bam, immortalized. Right?
Yeah.
Super easy. So it's interesting. But anyway, Newton and Hooke first got into sort of a dispute because Hooke said to Newton, yeah, your work on optics, I don't like it. Not a fan. I disagree. And Newton was like, how dare you? He retired. He basically retired from public life. He was just so offended after Robert Hooke criticized him that he holed himself up and just did his work on his own, just because he could not handle criticism, which is interesting. Not the best trait, but he invented gravity, so I guess he gets a pat, or discovered gravity. He did not invent gravity. There was gravity indeed before 1687. It's like one of those memes with the people in 1686 just floating around. But anyway, so yeah, Newton and Hooke, not the best of friends, constantly arguing. So the next event is the return of Halley's Comet. So Halley's Comet, I forget, I think it's every 80 years, is it, that it comes back? I don't know the next time it's coming back, but it'll be around. Maybe, yeah, Jamie, pull that up.
I'll pull it up.
No, I'm saying Sebastian. That's a joke from a while ago, a few streams ago. We had, yeah. But anyway.
What do you want me to pull up when Halley's Comet's coming next?
Yeah, just look up all the passes of Halley's Comet. So they probably have a Wikipedia list. So I know one of them was during the winter of 1680 and 1681, Halley's Comet came near the Earth, and people observed it. All the scientists were like, oh, isn't this interesting? But it wasn't called... Oh, yeah, so when's the next pass, and when was the last one?
The next pass is 2061. What?
All right.
Be, how old are we going to be? We're going to be...
57.
7. Oh, yeah. 57. That's going to be dope.
Yep.
So, 1060, the year 1066, 1066, if you will.
Okay.
Then
that's a pretty interesting one, actually, because that is when, the current British monarchy sort of started.
Yeah, it was thought to be an omen.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Then
I forgot the guy's name. Something the Great.
Right?
Sorry.
What'd you say?
Wasn't 1066 when they had like that war that basically like changed the way the English language worked?
Yeah, I imagine it was like this guy. But anyway, so when was the most recent one though?
The most recent one was in 1986.
Okay, so yeah, it's about 80 years, 75-ish years apart. 75 exactly, actually. So, but anyway, when the comet returned, Newton was pretty interested in it, and it sort of rekindled his interest in astronomy because he had been focusing on optics for a while. And so he observed it, a lot of the scientists observed it, and it wasn't called Halley's Comet yet. I don't know what they called it. Probably just a comet, I don't know. But Halley's Comet had been that thing that shows up every 75 years. But Edmund Halley, who was a contemporary of Newton, like 12 years younger than Newton, Halley he would predict when the comet would return. His prediction was 1756, and I believe that is accurate. That is when the comet returned, 1756.
Now I gotta get back to the thing.
Yeah, he has to get back to the thing.
1759.
Oh, okay, 1759. Sorry. So yeah,
because Jupiter messed it up.
Jupiter messed it up. Wow, how dare he?
Way to go.
So Halley predicted the return of the comet, and also just using all the orbital things. He predicted like back through history using his calculations, and he was like, oh, look at this, all the historical records of this comet sort of match my predictions. And so when the comet returned in 1759, confirming Halley's predictions and sort of confirming that he was correct, that is when it became known as Halley's Comet. So it's Halley's because he predicted it, so good on him. But Edmund Halley himself was actually important in Isaac Newton finally writing the Principia Mathematica. So, writing the Principia, we've got Robert Hooke sort of pissed him off into doing it a little bit. Basically, Robert Hooke was asking Newton for contributions to the Royal Society, like he was supposed to do, essentially. Newton was sort of shirking his responsibilities a little bit. And so Newton was like, he was just angry. So he often, he would do things just to spite Robert Hooke. So he wanted to, contribute something, and whatnot. So, yeah, Hooke sort of spurred him into doing it. Other people involved were Flamsteed, John Flamsteed, and Edmund Halley. So both of them were astronomer royals. They were the astronomer of the Royal Society. Flamsteed was the first one. Halley was the second one, I believe. And so Halley, so Newton and Flamsteed were sort of in communication with each other, in correspondence. And Flamsteed asked Halley to go over and chat with Newton just about his work. And so Halley came over. And he asked Newton the rhetorical question that everyone was wondering at the time. Well, not the rhetorical question, but a rhetorical question, which was, if gravity was proportional to, if gravity was inversely proportional to the square of distance, then what shape would planets move in? And so this was an interesting problem because it was accepted that the planets moved in elliptical orbits because that was Kepler's, that was part of Kepler's 3 laws, and that was, a while ago. And so people knew it was elliptical, but they didn't know why they were elliptical. And so Halley was saying, if the force was inversely proportional to the square of distance, what would it be? And so no one really knew the answer to that, because if they did, they would be like, oh, it's elliptical. But Newton knew the answer to that because obviously he worked out his formula of gravity. And so Newton said, oh, it would be an ellipse, of course. And Halley was like, what do you mean, of course? Nobody knows this. What are you talking about? And so this is sort of another instance where Newton just...
I gotta grab a cable real quick.
Oh, yeah, okay. So this is sort of another instance where Newton just throws out something revolutionary very nonchalantly. He's just like, yeah, it would be an ellipse. And so Halley's like, wow, you got to publish this. And so the reason no one else had figured that out yet was because no one else had calculus. Newton had calculus. So, yeah, so he figured out that the planets would move in elliptical orbits, and, that's how he figured out gravity. So all these events combined got him to actually write the Principia instead of, just the work existing as scattered notes in the back of his house, essentially. These people sort of got him directly and indirectly. Halley was the most direct. Halley was the one that convinced him to make this a published work. But they all got him to, write it down and formalize the Principia Mathematica. So, the Principia Mathematica, it was published in 1687, and it really propelled Isaac Newton into fame. He became very famous after this. I mean, he was already, a noble as a child, and then he became part of the Royal Society, which was prestigious, but writing the Principia, put him on top of, he was the premier scientist of the world. So, the Principia Mathematica is Latin for, what is it? Mathematical, I actually don't know. The full name is Philosophiæ, blah, blah, blah.
I got it. I'll do it.
But, yeah, so the Principia Mathematica, it was written in Latin, and actually, I'll go to the next slide, because the next slide is the actual thing. So, the Philosophiæ Naturalis...
It means the mathematical principles of natural philosophy.
Okay, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. But yeah, the Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, often shortened to Principia or Principia Mathematica. It was written in Latin. And so this is interesting. Latin was the sort of universal language in Europe for science during this period in time. Previously, Latin had been the universal language of the theology. So when everyone in Europe was Catholic, all the Bibles were written in Latin. They were not written in any other language. And the reason for that was that it was sort of this gets into the Protestant Reformation, which was a whole thing. But basically, the Catholic Church was sort of elitist, I guess you could say, because only the priests could read, and the literacy rate was super low in Europe, and so it was all a mess. But Martin Luther, with the Protestant Reformation, he wrote the first Bible translated into the German dialect where he lived, and so religion, especially amongst the Protestants, became decentralized by language. So, in the Anglican Church, it was written in English. That was the King James Bible, I believe. I believe he came before Newton's time, King James I of England. But anyway, science was still written in Latin. And there's some merit to that, because that means that if all the scientists learn Latin and publish in Latin, it means that a scientist in Germany, like, say, Leibniz, could read the works of a scientist in England. And there's, no translation required. Super easy. Today, I would say English has sort of become that type of language. English, I mean, it's a little Anglo-centric, but English, if you live in Europe, especially, if you live in, Germany or Italy, in schools, they teach English, because English essentially, actually they did a study on this, and it was that for a non-English speaker, learning English more than any other language gives you the highest salary increase in your career. So English is kind of this universal language now, not universal, but I would say quite widespread, So at this point in time, it was Latin. That's sort of what I'm trying to say. So so this was written in Latin, and the thing you see in the middle there are Newton's 3 laws of motion written in Latin, and I just find that interesting because I can't really make any sense of this because corpus omne perseverare, okay. It kind of makes sense though, because you see like persevere in there, and that makes me think of...
I could translate it.
Yeah, well, I know that's the first law of motion, which is like an object in motion will stay in motion, object at rest will stay at rest. And so the word persevere, sort of reminds me of that. But anyway.
Yeah, I was going to do it word for word.
Nice.
So that,
but
I wonder if this is object, like body.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, corpus. Yeah. Interesting.
He's... Yeah.
But anyway, so these were the 3 laws of motion. This was when Newton published the 3 laws of motion, published in the same work as the equation for gravity and the laws, or the law of gravitation. It's not that complicated. It's just that equation in the top right. And so Newton published this, and it was well received. Little bit of controversy with Robert Hooke saying plagiarism and whatever, but that is all bygones.
I don't want to call them the laws of motion anymore now that we have this. I want to call them the leges motus.
Leges motus, I agree. Leges motus sounds so much cooler. And yeah, it sounds like incantations. It sounds like a spell. Just pull up to your science class and when the teacher asks you, what's the first law of motion? Just recite corpus omne persevere. And they will be like, stop. Why are you trying to summon a demon? Get out of here. But anyway, this is the Principia. And let's go to the next slide. So, Parliament. Newton became the representative for Cambridge in the British Parliament. So he was still part of the Royal Society. He wasn't really lecturing much anymore, but by becoming famous, he sort of kind of semi-retirement. It's people tend to say move into government positions and stuff. This was pretty standard at the time. He had done a lot of work, and so now he became part of Parliament. But it said that he didn't do much in Parliament. He was only there for 2 years, and I believe on the Wikipedia page it says the one thing he ever said in Parliament was "It's cold in here, close the window," which is interesting. So yeah, but he was part of Parliament, so he had gotten essentially popular enough that he could be elected to Parliament. Although it wasn't completely at this point democratic, it was semi-democratic. The Crown had more power than Parliament at this point, I would say, whereas now it's really just a figurehead. But anyway, so then he became the warden of the Royal Mint. So not the master of the mint, which is what he would eventually become, which is in charge. But he worked at the Royal Mint for a little bit, making money. He was part of I think it was called the Great Recoinage of England or something. They had a problem with their currency. He overhauled things. And it's interesting because some view his work in the Royal Mint as an extension of his work in alchemy because, coinage, they weren't banknotes. It's made of metals. So mixing the alloys and the percentages and figuring out how coins should be made could be seen as an extension of alchemy a little bit. So that's another job he had. And then he had his conflict with Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. And so Gottfried accused him of plagiarism for calculus because Leibniz was I invented calculus, and Leibniz actually published, formally published his work on calculus, and when Newton sort of used calculus and took credit for it, Leibniz was what are you doing? You stole this from me. And so Newton argued back because, again, since Newton had the tendency to sit on his work, he had done calculus very early on, and so then he accused Leibniz of plagiarism, and it was just a bit of a mess. But as I said previously, historians now agree that they independently developed calculus. So while Newton was in quarantine, he developed calculus, but he didn't really tell anyone, and so on his own, Leibniz also developed calculus. He was just the first to actually publish it. So yeah, so that conflict was interesting, but yeah, this man, Newton, I feel like it would be interesting to interview or talk to him, because I imagine he is, like, not the most, how would you say this? Like, he's a bit of a, like, argumentative person. He's not very, like, likable, I would say. He doesn't have a lot of charisma. But charisma does not matter when you discover gravity, you know? Charisma does not matter at a certain point. But he definitely got into a lot of these fights, and eventually it kind of seems like it would make, like, a good sitcom or, like, drama show, just like a reality TV show, just to have all of these 1600s and 1700s British and European scientists just arguing. I feel like that can make a few good episodes. Like, Newton alone can make a few good episodes. But anyway, they sort of share the fame for calculus now. I outlined that earlier, so I'll just go to the next slide. So later life, 1703 to 1727. At this point, 1703, Newton would already be 60 years old, so, you know, he's kind of retiring, he's kind of done with his career. And so in 1703, he is elected president of the Royal Society, and yeah, he is in charge of the Royal Society. Oh, and you might see one of the previous presidents of the Royal Society, Montague. He was a person that got Newton a job at the Royal Mint as warden of the Mint. So Newton was both president of the Royal Society and warden of the Royal Mint. And so, yeah, he was pretty, like, again, he was very well renowned, like, people loved him. So maybe not personally, but, you know, he was just, his reputation sort of spoke for him. And so as president of the Royal Society, he would just preside over their meetings, like, make sure everything's orderly, like, nothing too intensive, I would say. But again, since the Royal Society is such a prestigious, you know, society to be, like, allowed into, becoming the president of the Royal Society is, like, the next level of even more prestigious. So Newton really was an incredible figure because, like, his accolades really just piled up. So the next thing was a work called Opticks with a K, just because they spelled things differently. I mean, this is only, like, 100 years after Shakespeare. So English had not had much time to evolve. So this work, for some reason, he published it in English instead of Latin. Maybe there were also Latin editions for, like, other countries, but he also published it in English, whereas the Principia was in Latin primarily. So the Opticks was just a ton of work on just how light works. So he lists a few axioms here. And some of these axioms are simple things like, I think axiom 2 is the angle of incidence is equal to the angle of reflection. I cannot talk. I have difficulty speaking. I don't know why. I always trip over my words. But anyway, I do not know. I do not. Maybe I speak too fast. I think I speak too fast for my. I think I'm trying to say things. You know what I mean? But anyway, but basic things like, you know, that light bounces off a mirror in a V shape. That was him in Opticks. So he published this, and this involved some calculus too. And again, Leibniz was just like injury. He was triggered. But yeah, so the next slide we got Sir Isaac Newton. Don't forget the title. It's Sir. And so this occurred in 1705. And the previous slide was 1704. This is all chronological order. So 1705, he was knighted by Queen Anne I. And yeah, it was interesting. I think quite a few people have been knighted. It's interesting, like, knighting, theoretically, isn't it supposed to be the practice of, like, you are a knight now, you protect the king. Oh, we've got some UE Films chat. UE Films says, happy birthday, Seb.
It's not my birthday. It's just not even close.
Yeah, he's a little late. Anyway, that completely derailed me. But yeah, so a lot of people have been knighted now. Like, you've got Sir, like a ton of actors are sirs, are knights. So it's not really like an actual duty to, I mean, maybe it's theoretically a duty to protect the crown, but like they're just assuming that they won't be called upon. Like, so it's sort of a ceremonial position, just like how the monarchy itself has become a ceremonial position. But yeah, so he had the title of Sir Isaac Newton because he was a fairly distinguished figure. We've got some birthday cake emojis from UE Films. I suppose he hasn't seen our comment yet. It's your birthday. Happy birthday.
Now my birthday.
Like anniversary of your channel or something, like a cake day?
Is it? It might be.
Oh.
I think I made it in... No, I made it in like October, right? Because when I made my
Night
channel,
with a K, Brendan.
Posted my first video, they were different because I posted my first video 6 months ago, but my actual channel was made October 26th.
Brendan is a funny
still off.
He says night ? And then puts emojis of the night sky and then the phases of the moon. And no, it's night with a K. Night with a K. So he became Sir Isaac Newton. And just sort of this later life period is just a series of like awards. It's just like, here's another medal and another medal. President of the Royal Society, now Sir Isaac Newton. And this next slide, I believe, Master of the Mint. So,
Yep.
Master of the Mint, I suppose you could, not quite. I was about to say like Treasury Secretary, but I don't think that's quite accurate. It's more like, well, it's Master of the Mint. So he was in charge of making money. He was in charge of punishing counterfeiters. Oh my God. Brendan writes, it is in fact your birthday, and then Knight K ? Knight with a K. Knight. Anyway. So
It is not my birthday.
So as Master of the Mint.
Time zone or something.
So
yeah, it's my birthday on like Mars or something. I don't know.
It might be. Oh, I've lost track of my Martian birthdays. I think I'm like 7 or 8 in Martian years. So that's fun. I'm just gonna ignore any more comments.
Your age on other worlds. Okay, hold on. Alright, my birthday. My credit card information.
Social security number. But yeah, anyway, so I'm just gonna... okay.
I am just 104... Oh, it gives me days than years.
Okay.
That's kind of...
That's...
So I'm 67 on Mercury.
Alright.
26 on Venus. I'm 16.1 on Earth. I am 8.5 in Martian years, so we're all 8.5.
8.5.
I am 1.35 years old on Jupiter. And I am 0.5 Saturn years, so 6 months old on Saturn. 0.19 on Uranus, 0.09 on Neptune, and I've basically yet to be born on Pluto.
I love the inclusion of Pluto. Pluto is such an... this isn't the right place to make this point, but Pluto is just such an oddity, I must say, in like how we consider it, because it was a planet, but now it's not, so it still is sort of gets planetary status in a lot of ways, because no one would put Eris in as one of the objects to calculate your age on. But anyway, so Isaac Newton was made master of the mint. So
here you go. Brendan was actually off. Brendan was actually off by 1 week, a week and a day, because in a week and a day, I'm 66.9 on Mercury right now. In a week and a day, I turned 67 years old. So Brendan was close. If he had done this on last week's stream,
yeah, it's funny. He left a few more comments. I heard that dude who invented gravity threw wicked parties. I think it's Seb's birthday. I'm being ignored. This is harassment. Anyway, I'm just gonna continue. So, as Master of the Mint, Isaac Newton wasn't actually expected to do anything. He was like, as Master of the Mint, it was I forgot the term they used when I was reading about this, but they said it was essentially a role, like with a salary that was there just sort of like a pension. Like, I don't think they quite had pensions yet, so instead they would basically give these people essentially like useless jobs, like jobs that you don't actually need to do anything for, but that you still get the salary because you have the job. But instead of, taking this job and not doing anything, Newton actually like got really into it. And so he would do some interesting tactics in trying to find counterfeiters and other people. I forgot what the term was, but it was basically some people would counterfeit currency, but others would like extract a little bit of metal from the coin and then return it back into the system, so that since the currency was on the gold standard, it would basically be devaluing the currency, which would be that. So it's like you scrape off a few flecks of gold from a gold coin, and then you pay for something. If you get a ton of gold coins and flake a few scraps off from each one, then you can sell some gold. Whereas, and it's like not good for an economy. But now coins tend to be made of useless metals. Although pennies are worth more in metal than they are in penny, but higher values are represented with just useless paper. So Newton, something that he would do is he would go covertly and spy on people, like try to eavesdrop on them and hear if they are gloating about committing money fraud.
Dude was a snitch.
Yeah.
Dude was a snitch.
So I like to think that he went into a bar. He would go into like pubs and stuff, but I like to think he goes in there with like a baseball cap and like dark sunglasses. Of course, completely anachronistic, but he would basically go in there covertly because he was Isaac Newton, so everyone kind of knew him, but he would sort of like sneak in there, and then at the bar, like at the place behind him, he'd hear a suspect saying like, "Oh yeah, I totally counterfeited all those coins, yo." And so then Newton would be like, "You are under arrest. You have violated the law." And then they would be sentenced to hang because counterfeiting was a capital offense in 1700s Britain. So, yeah. So he had some people executed, which is interesting. But, he was master of the mint. That was his job. So now we get to the death of Isaac Newton in 1727. So all of the roles, the president of the Royal Society and the master of the mint, those positions continued up until his death in 1727. Like, he held those positions until the end of his life, as well as, of course, being knighted, which is obviously more permanent than just like a job. So let's get into his death. So Isaac Newton died of like lung issues. It is presumed for the last 2 years of his life he would often have like coughing fits, and he lived in London as Master of the Mint and President of the Royal Society of London. But because of his lung issues, he was moved out into the countryside because, again, London is disgusting. And the air was disgusting. Even before the Industrial Revolution, the air was...
London.
The air was not...
Hate London.
The air was not fit to breathe, so Newton, with his lung problems, needed to get out into the countryside. And the fresh air improved his issues temporarily, but then he declined again. He was able to attend one last Royal Society meeting. He basically presided as the president over the meeting, but then by the end of the meeting, he was crumpled. He was just not doing well by the end of the meeting. He was like, oh my god, I need to get out of here. So then he returned to the countryside where he lived with his niece, but it was his half niece, I believe. It was his half brother's. So the children of his mother and his stepfather, his mother and his stepfather had 3 kids, and so the children of one of those half siblings was who took care of him when he was dying. Her and her husband took care of him, and so eventually Newton died in his home of these lung issues. So something discovered in his autopsy was that they took some of his hair, and studied it. They were like, what's in his hair? And they found mercury in his hair, and they're like, uh-oh, that ain't good. So
they knew mercury was bad at this point.
They did. Right? They knew it was bad. But they didn't think it wouldn't really cause lung problems particularly. But they assumed that's why he was eccentric later in life, because he was quite literally mad as a hatter in a certain sense, because, the hatters would use mercury. And so since Newton had mercury poisoning, it would make sense that he would be a little eccentric. But he was already eccentric to begin with. So it just did not help the situation. And so you might be thinking, what is the source of this mercury? Why did he just randomly...
in his eye. He just did that. Straight up.
That was pre-mercury. Pre-mercury was needled in the eye. So just imagine post-mercury.
And his eye's I might start doing this recreationally.
Yeah, exactly. So the source of the mercury poisoning is now suspected to be his forays into alchemy, because he was interested in alchemy. He likes alchemy.
Is big in alchemy.
Yeah, so he was as I said, because of the reason he was more willing to accept the possibility of action at a distance, that was partly because of his alchemical beliefs. And so this is interesting actually, because alchemy eventually evolved into chemistry, but this was sort of the midpoint. There were some real chemists at this time, Boyle was a real chemist. He was the most famous chemist of that time period. But Newton was more of the alchemy side of the whole alchemy chemistry continuum. Even for his time, it was a little taboo actually, because alchemists often were charlatans, so they would sort of defraud the royal, essentially. They would go to the kings of various European nations, the kings and queens, the royal families. They were all getting duped by fake alchemists. And of course, alchemy is just generally fake, but, since they did rely on some principles of chemistry, occasionally they'd be able to skirt by. But whenever an alchemist got, outed for fraud, they would be naturally executed for deceiving a royal family. And so In England, alchemy was sort of like taboo because no one really wanted to do alchemy. It was frowned upon because it was just viewed as like a crummy field, as pseudoscience, but Newton was interested in it anyway. So that's likely where he got the mercury poisoning because, you know, alchemists, they'd work with the quicksilver, the liquid metal, you know, it's all the rage, mercury. It's interesting stuff. Yeah, and so obviously he probably wasn't taking proper lab procedure. I imagine, you know, there's no plastic to make plastic eye coverings. There's no latex gloves to handle mercury with. And mercury in general is just a very dangerous substance to begin with, so he had some mercury poisoning. And so Isaac Newton was buried at Westminster Abbey, and that is where many royals, like royal family of England, have been buried. So, again, like I keep reiterating, because many like artists and even many scientists go unrecognized in their time. Like I'm trying to think of an artist. Like I think a lot of the musicians, musical composers, like everyone was like, yeah, this is trash. But then later, after they're dead, they're like, hey, this is pretty good. Yeah. So this was not the case with Newton. It was the exact opposite. People like instantly recognized Newton as soon as like he published the Principia. Like he was a science superstar. Everyone was like, Newton is amazing. So he was buried at Westminster Abbey, which is obviously a big honor, as that's where the royals are buried. So his funeral was held there, or, you know, because he's there. That's where his body is. You can, like, go there. You can see the grave, the tomb, essentially. And so it is debated whether or not Voltaire actually attended this funeral. As I said, Voltaire was the first to write down Newton's likely apocryphal story of the apple falling on his head. But Voltaire was in England at the time that Newton died, although we don't know that he went to Newton's funeral. So that's up in the air. But he was at least in close enough contact with Newton's niece that Newton's niece could tell him the story about the apple. So that's some interesting connection, but that is really it. So I got this timeline here of some famous people. So you've got Galileo Galilei, Johannes Kepler, and René Descartes, all predated Isaac Newton. Then you've got Robert Boyle, Isaac Barrow, John Locke. So John Locke, actually, Isaac Newton and John Locke occasionally like spoke to each other. And you might find this surprising because John Locke was sort of similar to Voltaire. You might have learned about him in a history class as an Enlightenment thinker and a writer. And he was, but he was also like, again, since everything was sort of mingled together, all of like academia was really intertwined, Locke would occasionally investigate like chemistry. And so through Robert Boyle, Newton and Locke would get in contact, and so they would discuss things eventually. Locke reviewed the Principia pretty positively. At one point in his life, Isaac Newton had like a mental breakdown, and he like threw accusations at John Locke, and I believe the accusations were that he was trying to embroil him with women. That was the accusation. So Newton accused Locke of like trying to get him with other women to like, whereas he like took the oath of chastity. So he snapped. I forgot why, but it was this
so strange.
Yeah, Newton, again, very strange person, but so yeah, there was this like one instance where he just like snapped and like went crazy on everybody, and it like took him a little while to recover. But then other contemporaries, you got Robert Hooke, Gottfried, Leibniz, John Flamsteed, and Edmund Halley, who was a bit younger, and then Voltaire, who was, you know, quite later. And the first three people, as well as the last person, if they go off the bounds of the thing, it doesn't mean they died at exactly that date. You know, they continued out. So this also shows you sort of the timeline of British monarchy. So you've got Charles I, who eventually gets deposed, and then Charles II. Charles II, then someone else, not important because they were only there for 3 years. But then you had William I, and the first is the one that knighted Isaac Newton. Then you had George I and George II, and George II was Newton's last king during his lifespan. And then George III, who would be the next one right after, he was the one. He's our George III that everyone knows and hates, the one that the tyrants that lost the American colonies. So, yeah. So that's sort of a timeline to put in context Newton's life with all of history, because I think that's a pretty important thing to think about, just a lot of the context of these people, because there's a tendency to think of them in isolation, and sometimes there's sort of distance between things that happened at the same time in history, which is really interesting. So yeah, just as Newton was in his later life, as he was sort of famous and rich, he had holdings in American companies, companies that were American colony companies. So he actually was, Sebastian, involved a little bit in the American colonies, although he never went there. He just owned a ton of stock, and then he lost a ton of money because this company shut down. But he was fine in the end. So, other than the mercury and the lung problems, but yeah, he was fine. He did well for himself. So, final thoughts. That's it today. Shorter stream, but I have to go shortly. I have to leave the house at 7 p.m. So this ended at a pretty convenient time, I would say. What do you guys think? The life of Isaac Newton.
Funny dude.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he was crazy. Definitely crazy. Crazy guy. And if I could meet him, I would be like, you're kind of a beta dude. And then skirt off. You know?
Interesting.
I feel like today's society. You know?
In today's society, how would Newton be?
He would not like it, man.
Yeah, he would have the headphones on. Yeah, he's the introvert. He's classic introvert. Yeah, I think it would be really cool to interview Isaac Newton, although obviously that's not possible. I would find it interesting to know what Newton thought about space travel, because you might know the Newton's cannon thought experiment, which sort of helped him think about gravity, which is the concept that if you fire a cannon off a hill, eventually the cannonball will fall to the ground. If you fire it at a faster initial velocity, it'll fall at a farther distance. But since the Earth is a sphere, there must be a speed at which when you fire the cannon, the ball will just start rotating around the Earth and go into orbit. And so that's how he sort of connected the concept of throwing an object and the fact that objects fall in Earth's gravity with the concept of the moon going around the Earth. So yeah, I would find it interesting to know what he thinks about space travel, about sending people into orbit, about the International Space Station that pretty much just follows his idea of the cannon. And the first space travel proposal, sort of in science fiction, was the Voyage dans la Lune, a trip to the moon, but it was French. It was a movie, a book, and then a film, I think. And in it, people are shot out of a cannon to the moon. That's how they get to the moon in that book, which is interesting because that's kind of like how we do it today, although instead of using a cannon, we use rocket engines. But it's sort of the same sort of ballistic firing method, chemical explosions. Instead of gunpowder, we're using hydrazine or whatever they use, rocket fuel. So yeah, I think it would be really interesting to see Isaac Newton's reaction to the modern world, although we will never know. That is just an impossibility, unfortunately. But yeah, so very interesting guy, Isaac Newton. Brought a lot of new information to the world, and that is all I have to say. So unless you guys have anything else to say, I will start wrapping up here.
I think I could take him.
In what regard?
In a fight, I think I could take him.
What kind of fight? Battle of wits or physical fight?
Like Kmart parking lot.
Okay.
Right here. How much did he weigh? Newton. Weight. Dude weighed. Not how much weight is a Newton.
Yeah, well, Newton. I was about to say the Newton is a measure of weight. It's the metric system's measure of weight. And whereas the kilogram is mass, newtons are weight, and pounds are weight.
He was 5'6". I could throw.
Oh, I'm as tall as Isaac Newton.
Yeah.
Well, remember, everyone used to be shorter in the past by like a few inches. People used to be like 5'7".
So you're saying that I could beat up like Genghis Khan?
You probably could in like a he
think
might
he
have
was
like
tall.
martial arts.
Yeah.
How Genghis Khan?
I think Genghis Khan.
Modern warrior versus an equivalently trained ancient warrior could probably be.
He was 6'2".
Yeah, no, Genghis Khan was tall. But like Napoleon, you can beat up Napoleon, I suppose, if it's just a height game. But anyway, Jacob, I would like to thank you for being our guest this week. Thanks for coming on the stream.
Thanks.
Yep, and yeah, you're always welcome back. Thanks for like coming on so many times. You've probably been on here like 5 or 6 times, right? Yeah, great guest. Make sure to check out. Sorry, go ahead.
He's a fantastic guest. You are a fantastic Jacob.
Yeah, make sure to check out his channel. I'll reiterate in the description below. It's well, let's see. It's the first link. So yeah, so go check that out. You might have to reload the page. Here, wait. Let me make sure it's actually, because previously it might not have updated yet. Yeah, okay, it updated. So if you don't see that link, make sure to reload. But Sebastian, I would like to thank you for being my co-host as always. And okay, and I would like to thank the audience for being a wonderful audience as always, excluding you, Phil. I'm just kidding. We've got a...
Wait, he's back!
Oh my god. Stop it.
He's back!
Was Newton a junkie? Are you a junkie? I don't know.
Is this Stop It?
Yeah, Stop It.
It's Stop It.
Oh my god.
After all these years,
After all these years. What was he trying to say? I remember it was H-E, right?
H-A. And that was it. He was just laughing at us.
Okay.
Laughing at us.
Are you a junkie? That's definitely directed at me.
Yeah, I'll assume so. Newton was not a junkie, nor am I a junkie. Sebastian, you can answer that question, I guess, for yourself as well.
My name's 128 Seconds.
Okay. And,
I have a counter question for you. Do you think that Newton would mind if we called him Newt?
Newt.
He would mind, but he could not stop us. He would not.
I don't think he would appreciate it. Anyway, Newt. Well, I find it really interesting that Stop It returned. I do not know who Stop It is. I would sort of like to find out. I mean, he was here like 2 seasons ago. Well, Stop It. I hope that you start making it a habit to watch the live stream again. Because it's fun to hear.
I feel like he's gonna become the main villain. Like we had a couple of like foreshadowing of his coming, like how in the end credits Marvel movies, like Thanos was always there. It's him. He's gonna be the new Silas. Honestly.
Oh no! Don't alienate the audience. Come on, we need every view we can get.
This isn't alienating him. This is including him.
It's encouraging him. Yeah, you're in the plot.
Super villain.
You're part of the plot now. And with that character development, this is no longer a filler episode. This is officially a plot-relevant episode of the Gravity Max live stream, the series Gravity Max live stream that has great continuity. Come back next week at 5 p.m. on Sunday to find out what happens with Stop It. And with that, I am going to end the stream. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
All right.